Hi, I'm Lucen Halreth, and for 23 years, my in-laws treated me like I was beneath their family name. They made me sit at the folding table during holidays, while everyone else got the dining room. Coralyn's mother would introduce me to neighbors as the disappointment our daughter married, and her father openly told people I'd never amount to anything worthwhile. They banned me from family photos and left me out of every major decision about my own wife's life. But now they're back, tears streaming down their faces, begging me to save their crumbling empire. What changed? You'll want to hear this, because what they did after that first Thanksgiving dinner was far worse than just humiliating me. The will reading last month revealed something that shattered their perfect little world, and now the same people who spent decades calling me worthless are desperate for the one thing only I can give them: mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a battlefield, polished so perfectly I could see my reflection staring back. Coralyn's family sat on one side, her mother Lucen Halreth, her father Theric Corvan, and her brother Jonas Thalvin, all dressed in their finest funeral attire, backs straight, chins raised like they were posing for a portrait of superiority. I sat alone on the other side, wearing the same black suit I'd bought for my wedding 23 years ago, the one they'd made snide comments about at the reception. The lawyer, Eleanor Fitzwilliam, adjusted her glasses and broke the seal on the envelope containing old Henrik Drevel's last will and testament. Henrik had been Coralyn's grandfather, the patriarch who built Drevel Industries from a single hardware store into a construction empire worth $40 million. He was also the only member of their family who'd ever treated me with genuine respect. "Before we begin," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I want to remind everyone that Mr. Drevel was of sound mind when he executed this document 6 months ago. He specifically requested that the entire family be present for this reading." Lucen shifted in her chair, diamond earrings catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. She'd worn them to every family gathering for the past 2 decades, always making sure to mention their appraised value within earshot of me. "Of course he was of sound mind," she said, voice dripping with the same condescension I'd heard at 1,000 family dinners. "Father was sharp until the very end." Theric nodded, his silver mustache twitching slightly. The man who'd spent years telling anyone who'd listen that his daughter had married down when she chose me over the banker's son he'd picked out for her. "Just get on with it," he said, checking his Rolex. "We have the funeral arrangements to finalize." I said nothing. I'd learned long ago that silence was my best defense in this room. 23 years of being the outsider had taught me to observe, to listen, to remember every slight and every sneer. They thought I was weak because I didn't fight back. They thought my quiet demeanor meant I was defeated. They had no idea how wrong they were. Eleanor opened the document and began to read. The first few items were predictable: small bequests to longtime employees, charitable donations to Henrik's favorite causes, family heirlooms distributed among various relatives. Lucen received her mother's jewelry collection. Theric got the vintage car collection, and Jonas inherited the family's cabin in the mountains. "To my granddaughter Coralyn Drevel Halreth," Eleanor continued, "I leave the sum of $50,000, with my love and hopes for her happiness." The room fell silent. $50,000. I watched their faces carefully, saw the confusion creeping in. In a $40 million estate, $50,000 was practically nothing. Coralyn had been expecting to inherit the house, maybe even a controlling stake in the company. We all had. "There must be some mistake," Lucen said, leaning forward. "Surely there's more for Coralyn." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Now, regarding the primary estate, the family home at Thornfield Heights, the controlling interest in Drevel Industries, and all remaining assets, totaling approximately $39 million. The silence stretched so tight, I thought it might snap. I could hear Jonas's breathing, shallow and quick. Theric's fingers drummed against the table. Lucen's composure cracked, just slightly, a tiny frown line appearing between her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. "These assets," Eleanor continued, "are hereby bequeathed in their entirety to Lucen Halreth." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Lucen gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Theric's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Jonas actually stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "That's impossible," Therick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's not even blood family." Eleanor looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Dravel was very specific. He considered Lucen to be the son he never had, and he wanted to ensure that someone with integrity would carry on the family legacy. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching their world crumble in real time. 23 years of being treated like hired help. 23 years of being excluded from family decisions. 23 years of being made to feel like I didn't belong, and Henrik had been watching it all. "There's also a personal letter," Eleanor said, sliding an envelope across the table to me. "He requested that you read it privately." I took the letter with steady hands, though inside I felt like a dam was about to burst. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper with my name written in Henrik's careful script. The same handwriting that had signed birthday cards for me when his own family forgot. The same hand that had penned encouraging notes when I was struggling to build my landscaping business. Visera finally found her voice. "This is outrageous. We'll contest it. No court would uphold such an obvious manipulation of an elderly man." "Mrs. Halcourt," Eleanor said firmly, "I can assure you that Mr. Dravel's mental faculties were thoroughly evaluated by 3 independent physicians before this will was executed. He also recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning. Would you like me to play it?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. I knew what Henrik would have said in that video. The same things he'd said to me privately over the years. How disappointed he was in his family's treatment of me. How proud he was of the man I'd become, despite their efforts to tear me down. How he'd watched them ostracize me while I quietly supported Coralyn through her struggles with addiction, while I worked 18-hour days to keep my business afloat after they'd sabotaged my early contracts, while I smiled and endured their insults for the sake of keeping peace. "No," Therick said quickly, "that won't be necessary." They filed out of the office in stunned silence, leaving me alone with Eleanor and the weight of everything that had just changed. Through the tall windows, I could see them huddled by their cars in the parking lot, Visera gesticulating wildly, Jonas pacing back and forth, Therick on his phone, probably calling their attorney. "He really loved you," Eleanor said softly. "Henrik spoke about you often. He said you were the only one who never asked him for anything, the only one who visited him just to visit, not because you wanted something." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The letter felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should feel. 23 years of humiliation, and now this. Now everything had changed. But I knew this was just the beginning. They wouldn't go quietly, and they wouldn't accept this gracefully. They'd be back, just like always. But this time, I wouldn't be the powerless man sitting at the folding table while they made decisions about my life. This time, I held all the cards. I drove through the iron gates of Thornfield Heights for what I knew would be the last time as a visitor. The long, winding driveway stretched ahead of me, lined with the oak trees I'd planted and maintained for 15 years. Every stone in the landscaping, every flower bed, every perfectly manicured lawn, I'd designed and cared for it all, usually working while the family entertained guests who didn't know my name. The mansion rose from the hillside like something from an old movie, all stone columns and sprawling wings, with windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in golden sheets. 42 rooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that most universities would envy, and a wine cellar that Therick had spent decades filling with vintages I wasn't allowed to touch. I knew every inch of this place better than the people who'd grown up here. I parked my truck, the same weathered Ford I'd been driving for 12 years, next to the circular fountain where Henrik used to sit and watch me work. He'd bring 2 cups of coffee out on summer mornings, and we'd talk about everything except the obvious tension that followed me through his family's life like a shadow. He never asked why I put up with it, and I never asked why he allowed it. We both knew the answers would hurt too much to say out loud. The key to the house felt strange in my hand. I'd never had one before. For 23 years I'd knocked and waited like a delivery man, even though I was married to their daughter, even though I'd been coming here twice a week for over 2 decades. They'd made it clear that ownership and belonging were 2 different things, and I'd never qualified for the second. I walked through the front door and stood in the marble foyer, breathing in the scent of lemon oil and old money. The grandfather clock in the corner, a Dravel family heirloom from 1847, chimed 4 o'clock, just like it had every hour of every day I'd spent in this house. But something was different now. The sound didn't feel like a timer counting down my welcome. It felt like a bell marking the beginning of something new. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The portrait gallery stretched down the main hallway, 3 generations of Dravel faces staring down from their gilded frames. Henrik's father, the man who'd started the hardware store. Henrik's father-in-law, who'd expanded into lumber. Henrik himself, painted in his prime with the kind of confident smile that only comes from building something meaningful. And then Therick, posed with his hunting rifle and a look of inherited authority he'd never quite earned. Notably absent from the gallery, any photo that included me. 23 years of family events, and I'd been cropped out of history with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Coralyn used to promise she'd talk to them about it, but nothing ever changed. Eventually, I stopped asking and started avoiding the camera altogether. It was easier than fighting a battle I couldn't win. I climbed the grand staircase to Henrik's study, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors I'd helped refinish 10 years ago. The family had hired a contractor for the job, but when the work turned out shoddy, Henrik had asked me to fix it. I'd spent 3 weeks stripping and restaining every board, working nights and weekends while Therick complained about the noise and Visera worried about the smell of the finish affecting her dinner parties. Henrik's study was exactly as he'd left it, leather-bound books arranged with military precision, his massive oak desk clear except for a single fountain pen and an antique lamp that cast everything in warm amber light. The walls were covered with photographs from the construction sites where Dravel Industries had built its reputation, shopping centers, office buildings, the new hospital complex downtown that had won 3 architectural awards. I settled into the chair behind his desk and opened the letter Eleanor had given me. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind Henrik had always preferred for important correspondence. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood the weight of permanence. "My dear Lucen," it began, "if you are reading this, then my family has finally learned what I have known for years, that worth is not measured by bloodlines or bank accounts, but by character and integrity. You have shown both in abundance, even when they gave you every reason to abandon such principles." I had to stop reading for a moment. Through the window, I could see the garden I'd designed and planted for Henrik's 70th birthday. The roses were blooming exactly as I'd planned them to, a cascade of red and white that would continue throughout the summer. He'd insisted on paying me for the work, even though I'd offered to do it as a gift. "A man's labor has value," he'd said, "especially when it's done with love." The letter continued, "I have watched my family treat you with a coldness that shames me. I have seen them exclude you from decisions about your own wife's medical care. I have witnessed them diminish your accomplishments and mock your efforts to build something meaningful. I have stood by while they treated you like a stranger in your own marriage, and I will carry that regret to my grave." My hands tightened on the paper. He'd seen it all, every slight, every insult, every moment when they'd made me feel invisible. I'd thought I'd hidden it better, thought I'd maintained enough dignity to keep the worst of it private. But Henrik had been watching, remembering, quietly documenting their cruelty with the same attention to detail he'd brought to every business deal. "You may wonder why I never intervened more directly," the letter went on. "The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I challenged them too forcefully, they would take their anger out on you. Afraid that my protection would only make your situation worse. It was cowardice disguised as strategy, and I apologize for it." I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of revelation settle over me like a heavy coat. All those years, I'd thought I was enduring their treatment alone. I'd thought Henrik's kindness was just his natural disposition, not a deliberate counterweight to his family's cruelty. I'd thought the small gestures, the coffee conversations, the birthday cards, the way he always asked about my business, were just politeness. I'd never realized he was trying to balance the scales of their treatment, trying to show me that at least one person in this family valued my presence. The letter's final paragraph made my throat tight. "I am giving you the tools to build the life you deserve, free from their judgment and manipulation. Use this inheritance wisely, and know that you carry my hopes for justice and healing. You are the son I should have raised, and I am proud to call you family." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, right next to my heart. Outside, the sun was setting over the gardens I'd tended for 15 years, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this land in the first place. It had never been about the money or the status. It had been about the beauty, the potential, the way a handful of seeds could become something magnificent with patience and care. Now it was all mine, every acre, every tree, every stone, and every wall. But more than that, I finally had something I'd been searching for my entire adult life. Validation. Proof that my worth wasn't determined by their opinion of me. Evidence that someone had been paying attention to the man I'd tried to be, even when it felt like no one cared. Tomorrow, they would come. I knew them well enough to predict their strategy, guilt, manipulation, appeals to family loyalty, maybe even legal threats. They would try to convince me that I didn't deserve this inheritance, that Henrik had been manipulated or coerced. They would paint me as an opportunist who'd taken advantage of an old man's loneliness. But I had Henrik's letter now. I had his words, his reasoning, his love written in permanent ink. I had the truth, and for the first time in 23 years, the truth was strong enough to stand against their version of reality. The first Thanksgiving dinner at Thornfield Heights should have been a celebration. Coralyn and I had been married for 6 months, and I was still naive enough to believe that time and proximity would eventually win over her family. I'd spent weeks preparing for that dinner, researching their traditions, bringing expensive wine that I couldn't really afford, practicing conversations in my head that I thought might bridge the gap between their world and mine. I arrived early, hoping to help with the preparations, only to discover that help wasn't what they wanted from me. Visira took one look at the wine I'd brought, a $30 bottle that had required me to skip lunch for a week, and handed it to the housekeeper with instructions to put this with the other cooking wine. She didn't even check the label. "Lucen's here," she announced to the room with the same tone she might have used to report a plumbing problem. "I suppose we should set an extra place." An extra place, not my place, not the chair reserved for their daughter's new husband, but an extra place. As if my presence was an unexpected complication that required last-minute adjustments to their perfect family tableau. Therick emerged from his study wearing a velvet smoking jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He looked me up and down, taking in my department store suit and discount tie, and I watched his expression shift from mild annoyance to something approaching pity. "Coralyn said you'd be joining us," he said, making it sound like she'd warned them about a contagious disease. "I brought wine," I offered, trying to inject some warmth into the frigid atmosphere. "How thoughtful," Visira said, though her smile never reached her eyes. "I'm sure it will be perfect for the staff meal." The staff meal. I stood there for a moment, processing the insult, waiting for Coralyn to say something, to defend me, to remind her parents that I was family now. But Coralyn was busy arranging flowers with her cousin Morel Corvain, both of them laughing at some private joke that clearly didn't include me. They seated me at a small folding table in the corner of the dining room, close enough to technically be part of the family gathering but far enough away to make the hierarchy clear. The main table, a magnificent mahogany piece that could seat 12, hosted the real family. Therick at the head, Visira at his right, various aunts and uncles and cousins filling out the remainder. Henrik wasn't there that year. He was recovering from pneumonia and couldn't travel. I ate my turkey and stuffing alone, watching them pass dishes I couldn't reach, listening to conversations I wasn't invited to join, when Therick proposed a toast to family traditions and the people who understand their value. He looked directly at me while emphasizing the word understand, making it clear that I was not among that group. The worst part wasn't the isolation. It was watching Coralyn pretend it was normal. When I caught her eye across the room, she shrugged apologetically, but made no move to include me. When her cousin asked loudly enough for everyone to hear whether I was the help or something, Coralyn laughed it off instead of correcting her. When Visira told the table about Coralyn's previous boyfriend, such a distinguished young man from a wonderful family, my wife nodded along as if she agreed. After dinner they moved to the library for brandy and cigars. I wasn't invited to that either. Instead, I found myself in the kitchen, helping the actual staff clean dishes and listening to them gossip about the family with more warmth and inclusion than I'd experienced all evening. Maria, the housekeeper, pressed a piece of pie into my hands and patted my shoulder sympathetically. "They're not cruel people," she said in accented English. "They just don't know how to see past their own world." But they were cruel people, I realized as the years went by. Not violent or explosive, but cruel in the way that water carves through stone. Slowly, persistently, with a patience that eventually wears away anything in its path. Christmas was worse. They gave me a gift card to a hardware store, while everyone else exchanged meaningful presents that showed thought and attention. Easter brought another folding table, another meal eaten in isolation while they discussed family business I wasn't allowed to hear. 4th of July meant being handed a beer and pointed toward the servants' area during their famous backyard barbecue, while the real guests mingled on the terrace. The exclusion became systematic, refined, almost artistic in its cruelty. They would plan family vacations and mention them in front of me without extending an invitation. They would discuss Coralyn's medical appointments and school events as if I wasn't her husband, as if my opinion on my wife's life was irrelevant. They would make major decisions about family investments and business ventures at dinners I wasn't invited to attend. Then, act surprised when I expressed frustration about being left out of conversations that directly affected my household income. The breaking point came during year 3, when Coralyn was hospitalized for a severe allergic reaction. I rushed to the emergency room only to find that Visira had already provided the medical history, Therick had spoken with the doctors, and Jonas had made decisions about her treatment plan. The nurse looked confused when I identified myself as her husband. "Oh," she said, checking her clipboard. "The family said her next of kin was her father." I stood in that sterile hospital hallway, watching through a window as they surrounded my wife's bed, holding her hand, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances that should have been mine to give. When I tried to enter the room, Therick blocked my path. "She needs family right now," he said, as if I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. "I am her family," I replied, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "No," Visira said from behind him, her tone gentle but absolute. "You're someone she married. There's a difference." That night, I went home to an empty house and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, the cheap stuff, because expensive liquor was another luxury I couldn't afford on my landscaper's salary. I sat in our bedroom, surrounded by photos of our wedding day, looking at pictures of a ceremony where I'd been allowed to be the center of attention for exactly 4 hours before returning to my designated role as the outsider. In one photo, I was dancing with Coralyn, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. In another, I was shaking hands with Henrik, who had pulled me aside during the reception to tell me how proud he was to welcome me into the family. "You're a good man, Lucen," he'd said. "Don't let them convince you otherwise." I'd thought he was just being kind. I didn't realize he was giving me a warning. The pattern continued for 20 more years. 20 more years of folding tables and hardware store gift cards and being introduced as Coralyn's husband, with the same inflection other people use to say, Coralyn's contractor or Coralyn's accountant. 20 more years of watching them make decisions about my life while excluding me from the conversation. 20 more years of being treated like an employee who'd overstayed his welcome but couldn't quite be fired. They chipped away at me, piece by piece, comment by comment, exclusion by exclusion, until I started to believe they might be right. Maybe I wasn't good enough for their family. Maybe I didn't belong in their world. Maybe the best I could hope for was to be tolerated on the margins of my own marriage. But Henrik saw it all. Henrik remembered every slight, every insult, every moment when they'd made me feel less than human. And Henrik had been planning his response for 23 years, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that worth isn't measured by bloodlines or bank accounts, but by the content of a man's character. Now they knew. Now they understood. Now the tables had turned, and the man they'd spent decades humiliating held the keys to everything they'd taken for granted. The folding table had become a throne, and I was finally ready to claim it. The morning after that first Thanksgiving, I woke up before dawn with a knot in my stomach that felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. Coralyn was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful and untroubled, as if the previous evening had been perfectly normal. I lay there watching her breathe, wondering how the woman I'd married could sit at that dinner table and watch her family treat me like hired help without saying a single word in my defense. I slipped out of bed and stood in our small kitchen, staring out the window at the garden I'd been building in our backyard. It wasn't much. A few raised beds, some herbs, a struggling tomato plant that I'd nursed through 2 cold snaps, but it was mine. It was the one place where I felt competent, valuable, where my efforts produced something beautiful, instead of just enduring something ugly. When Coralyn finally woke up, I was sitting at our tiny breakfast table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She padded into the kitchen wearing one of my old t-shirts, looking rumpled and lovely, and for a moment I remembered why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place. "Morning, honey," she said, kissing the top of my head before moving to the coffee pot. "Did you sleep okay?" The casual normalcy of the question hit me like a slap. "Did I sleep okay?" I repeated. "Coralyn, your family made me eat dinner at a folding table." She paused, coffee mug halfway to her lips. "Oh, that? I meant to say something, but you know how Mother gets about her seating arrangements. She's very particular about tradition." "Tradition?" I stood up, feeling heat rise in my chest. "What tradition involves isolating your daughter's husband at family gatherings?" "Lucen, you're being dramatic." She settled into the chair across from me, wrapping her hands around her mug like it was a shield. "It's not personal. They just need time to adjust to having someone new in the family." 6 months isn't new," I said. 6 months is long enough to buy an extra chair." "They bought you a very expensive wedding gift," she said, her voice taking on that defensive edge I was already learning to recognize. "And they included you in all the family photos." That was true, technically. They had included me in exactly 3 family photos, standing at the edge of the group, usually partially cropped out, looking like someone who'd wandered into the frame by accident. And yes, they'd given us a wedding gift, a crystal vase that Visira had picked out, wrapped, and presented with a card that only had their names on it, as if I wasn't half of the couple receiving it. "Coralyn," I said carefully, "do you think the way they treated me last night was okay?" She sighed, the sound carrying a weight of frustration that I was beginning to realize wasn't directed at her family. "I think you're expecting too much too fast. These things take time." Time. That became the excuse for everything. When they excluded me from Coralyn's birthday planning, give them time. When they forgot to invite me to her cousin's wedding, these things take time. When they discussed her job prospects and career moves without including me in the conversation, they need time to see you as part of the family. But time didn't heal anything. Time only made their behavior more entrenched, more systematic, more refined in its cruelty. By year 2, they'd perfected the art of making me feel invisible while maintaining plausible deniability. They would ask Coralyn about your husband instead of using my name. They would make plans for family events while I was standing right there, then act surprised when I showed up. They would give me jobs to do during gatherings, mixing drinks, carrying chairs, helping with coats, that kept me busy and useful, but clearly established me as staff rather than family. The psychological toll was worse than I'd expected. I started second-guessing every interaction, analyzing every conversation for hidden insults or coded rejections. I would spend hours replaying dinner table exchanges, trying to figure out if Therek's comment about people who work with their hands was meant as a compliment or a dismissal. I would lie awake at night wondering if Visira's suggestion that I might be more comfortable helping in the kitchen was genuine concern or calculated humiliation. My confidence began to erode in ways I didn't immediately recognize. At work, I found myself apologizing for opinions I'd previously stated with conviction. With friends, I started declining invitations to gatherings where I'd have to explain my family situation. At home, I began deferring to Coralyn on decisions I'd once made independently, unsure if my judgment could be trusted when the people closest to her seemed to think so little of my capabilities. The worst part was how it affected my marriage. Coralyn and I had been passionate, equal partners before the wedding. But gradually she began treating me the way her family did, with a kind of patient tolerance that suggested I was a burden to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. She started making unilateral decisions about our social calendar, our finances, our future plans, always with the explanation that she was protecting me from her family's criticism. "I didn't tell them about your promotion," she'd say, "because I knew they'd find some way to diminish it." Or, "I handled the conversation about buying a house because they get so particular about financial matters." Or, "I thought it would be easier if I went to the family meeting alone, since they tend to get distracted when outsiders are there." Outsiders. That's what I was, after 2 years of marriage. Not family, not even a permanent fixture, but an outsider who might or might not be invited to participate in decisions about his own life. The breaking point should have been the hospital incident in year 3, but instead it became the moment I realized that fighting back would only make things worse. After that night in the emergency room, I tried to have a serious conversation with Coralyn about boundaries and respect. I told her that I felt excluded from my own marriage, that her family's treatment was affecting my mental health, that something needed to change if our relationship was going to survive. Her response was swift and devastating. "Maybe you're not as ready for this family as we thought you were." The "we" in that sentence hit me like a physical blow. Not "they think you're not ready, we think you're not ready." My own wife had aligned herself so completely with her family's perspective that she couldn't even see me as separate from their judgment. That night, I moved into the guest bedroom, not permanently, just until we could figure things out. But figuring things out apparently meant me learning to accept my designated role, rather than them learning to treat me with basic human dignity. After a week of sleeping alone, I apologized for being too sensitive, for expecting too much, for not understanding their traditions well enough. I moved back into our bedroom, but something fundamental had shifted. I'd learned that my feelings didn't matter as much as their comfort. I'd learned that my place in this family was contingent on my willingness to accept whatever scraps of respect they chose to throw my way. I'd learned that love, in their world, was conditional on compliance. So I complied. For 20 more years, I played the role they'd written for me. I smiled at their jokes about my background, my education, my income. I accepted their gift cards and their folding tables and their careful exclusion from anything that mattered. I let them make decisions about my wife's life while pretending I didn't notice. I became the ghost they wanted me to be. Present, but not really there. Involved, but not really included. Family, but not really family. I told myself I was being strategic, that patience would eventually pay off, that demonstrating my worth through quiet dignity would eventually win their respect. But the truth was simpler and more humiliating. I'd given up. I'd decided that being tolerated was better than being rejected completely, that half a marriage was better than no marriage at all. I'd let them break me down piece by piece until I forgot what it felt like to expect better treatment. I'd internalized their version of my worth until I believed it myself. I'd become exactly what they said I was. Grateful for whatever scraps they chose to share. Too weak to demand the respect I deserved. Too afraid of losing what little I had to fight for what I actually needed. But Henrik had been watching. Henrik had been remembering. Henrik had been planning a different ending to this story, one where the broken man in the corner would finally have the power to decide who deserved a seat at the table. The landscaping business started as an accident, born from the realization that I needed something in my life that belonged entirely to me. After 3 years of being treated like a ghost in my own marriage, I craved work that produced visible results, something I could point to and say, "I built that." When our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, asked if I could help redesign her backyard, I said yes without really knowing what I was doing. I spent weeks researching plant varieties, studying drainage patterns, learning about soil composition and seasonal growth cycles. I sketched designs on notebook paper during my lunch breaks, calculated measurements on the back of receipts, saved money for supplies by eating peanut butter sandwiches for 2 months straight. When I finally presented Mrs. Chen with a detailed plan for transforming her weedy half-acre into a garden paradise, she looked at the drawings with amazement. "You really know what you're doing," she said, and those 6 words hit me like electricity. It had been so long since someone had expressed confidence in my abilities that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as competent. The project took 3 weeks of evenings and weekends. I installed a flagstone pathway that curved through carefully planned flower beds, built raised planters for vegetables and herbs, planted a small grove of fruit trees that would provide shade and beauty for decades to come. When it was finished, Mrs. Chen invited the whole neighborhood over to see what I'd accomplished. Lucen designed and built all of this himself. She told everyone, her voice full of pride that my own family had never expressed. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Word spread faster than I'd expected. Within a month, I had 3 more projects lined up. Within 6 months, I was working every weekend and turning down requests because I couldn't keep up with demand. Within a year, I'd registered Halreth Landscaping as a legitimate business and was making more money from my side work than from my day job at the County Parks Department. The success felt surreal. For years, Coralyn's family had treated me like someone who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. Yet strangers were paying me thousands of dollars to design and build the most valuable outdoor spaces of their homes. Clients listened to my suggestions with respect, implemented my recommendations without question, referred me to their friends with glowing testimonials about my creativity and reliability. I started keeping a portfolio of before and after photos, documenting each project with the pride of an artist displaying his masterpieces. The transformations were dramatic. Weedy lots became magazine-worthy gardens, boring backyards became entertainment spaces that families treasured for decades. I had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems, for imagining beauty where others saw only work, but the real transformation was happening inside me. Every successful project rebuilt a piece of confidence that Coralyn's family had systematically destroyed. Every satisfied client reminded me that my judgment had value, that my skills produced results, that my vision could create something meaningful. Every referral proved that people trusted me with their most important investments. I hired my first employee in year 2, Tom Brennan, a kid fresh out of high school who had more enthusiasm than experience but was willing to learn. Teaching him the business forced me to articulate skills I'd developed instinctively, to break down complex design principles into learnable steps. Watching him master techniques I'd taught him gave me a satisfaction that family dinners had never provided. By year 5, I had 4 full-time employees and a waiting list of clients that stretched 6 months out. I had moved the business into a proper office space, invested in professional equipment, developed relationships with suppliers that gave me access to premium materials at competitive prices. The local newspaper ran a feature story about my work, calling me the artist transforming suburban landscapes one garden at a time. The irony wasn't lost on me. At family gatherings, Therick would hold court about his latest business achievements, detailing complex deals and financial maneuvers, with the confidence of someone who expected his audience to be impressed. Meanwhile, I sat at my folding table, quietly running a company that was growing faster than Dravel Industries, serving clients who valued my expertise more than his own family valued his legacy. I never talked about the business at family gatherings, partly because they never asked, and partly because I'd learned to protect the things that mattered to me from their particular brand of diminishment. When Vasira occasionally inquired about my little gardening hobby, I would give vague answers about staying busy while mentally calculating the revenue from projects that dwarfed their monthly household expenses. The portfolio grew into a showcase of artistic achievement that would have impressed even my harshest critics, if they'd ever bothered to look. I'd designed meditation gardens for stressed executives, play spaces for young families, therapeutic landscapes for elderly clients who needed beauty more than they needed practicality. Each project taught me something new about plants, people, or the intersection between human needs and natural systems. My favorite project came in year 8, a memorial garden for the Patel family, whose teenage daughter had died in a car accident. They wanted something living and beautiful that would honor her memory while providing a peaceful space for reflection. I designed a circular garden with her favorite flowers arranged around a small fountain, with curved benches positioned to catch the morning light she'd loved so much. When it was complete, Mrs. Patel wept as she walked the paths I'd created. "You understood," she said, squeezing my hands. "You understood what we needed before we even knew ourselves." That project won 3 industry awards and was featured in a national landscaping magazine, but the real reward was watching the Patel family find peace in the space I'd created for them. They sent me a card every year on their daughter's birthday, thanking me for giving them a place to remember her properly. By year 10, Halreth Landscaping had become one of the most respected firms in the region. I'd expanded into commercial projects, designing outdoor spaces for office complexes, hospitals, and municipal buildings. My work was featured in design magazines, referenced in university horticulture programs, copied by competitors who couldn't quite capture the integration of artistic vision and practical functionality that had become my signature. I bought a house, not a mansion, but a beautiful craftsman bungalow with 2 acres that I turned into a living showcase of my capabilities. The property became an informal showroom where potential clients could see what I could accomplish with unlimited creative freedom. I planted rare species, experimented with innovative design concepts, created outdoor rooms that flowed seamlessly from one theme to another. Henrik was my most frequent visitor during those years. He would arrive unannounced on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to discuss some maintenance issue at Thornfield Heights, but really to walk my gardens and talk about the business. He asked intelligent questions about my design philosophy, my expansion plans, my long-term goals. He treated my work with the respect that his family had never shown, seeing it as a legitimate artistic and entrepreneurial achievement rather than a hobby that might eventually grow into something real. "You've built something remarkable," he told me during one of those visits, gesturing toward a pergola where climbing roses framed a view of the vegetable gardens beyond. "This isn't just landscaping. It's environmental storytelling. You're helping people write the stories they want to live in." I had never heard my work described that way, but the phrase stuck with me. Environmental storytelling. That's exactly what I was doing. Creating spaces that reflected people's values, supported their dreams, enhanced their daily lives in ways that went far beyond simple decoration. When I incorporated the business in year 12, Henrik offered to invest. Not as a family favor, but as a legitimate business opportunity. He'd been watching my growth, studying my financial projections, analyzing my market position with the same attention he'd brought to his own investments. "You're sitting on a gold mine," he said. "With the right backing, you could franchise this concept nationally." I declined his offer, not because I didn't trust his judgment, but because I'd learned to value the independence that came from building something entirely through my own efforts. The business belonged to me in a way that nothing else in my life ever had. Every client, every project, every success was mine to claim without qualification or apology. By year 15, I was employing 27 people and generating annual revenues that exceeded most small manufacturers. I'd developed proprietary techniques for sustainable landscape design, created training programs that other companies licensed, established relationships with botanical gardens, and environmental organizations that used my work as models for their own projects. But more importantly, I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up. The man who'd sat at folding tables and accepted gift cards to hardware stores had become someone whose opinion was sought by industry leaders, whose techniques were studied by university students, whose vision transformed empty lots into living artworks that would outlive their creator. I was still married to Coralyn, still attended family gatherings, still played the role they'd assigned me, but internally, I'd constructed a parallel life where my worth wasn't determined by their approval, where my achievements spoke for themselves, where I was valued for what I created rather than tolerated for what I endured. The folding table couldn't diminish me anymore because I knew exactly what I was capable of accomplishing when given the chance to prove myself. Their gift cards couldn't insult me anymore because I was writing checks that dwarfed their household budget. Their exclusion couldn't wound me anymore because I'd built a world where I belonged completely. Henrik saw it all. Henrik celebrated it all. Henrik understood that the quiet man they'd systematically underestimated had grown into someone whose absence would leave a hole they couldn't fill. And when the time came to decide who deserved to inherit the empire he'd built, Henrik remembered which man had proven his worth through decades of patient effort, and which family had spent those same decades proving that inherited wealth doesn't guarantee wisdom, character, or the ability to recognize value when it's sitting right in front of them. They came to my office on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the will reading. I was reviewing landscape architectural plans for a new medical campus when my assistant Jessica knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before, part confusion, part amusement, part concern. "There are some people here to see you," she said carefully. "They say they're family, but they don't have an appointment. Should I tell them you're busy?" Through my office window, I could see them in the reception area. Visira perched on the edge of one of my leather chairs like she was afraid it might contaminate her designer dress. Theric pacing near the wall of industry awards with his hands clasped behind his back. Jonas slumped in the corner scrolling through his phone with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd never held a real job. But there was a fourth person with them, someone I didn't immediately recognize. A young woman, maybe 22 or 23, with Coralyn's dark hair and Henrik's intelligent eyes. "Give me 5 minutes," I told Jessica, "then show them in." I used those 5 minutes to center myself, to remember who I was now versus who I'd been 3 days ago. 3 days ago, I was the man who sat at folding tables and accepted their casual cruelty with quiet dignity. Today, I owned everything they'd assumed would be theirs. Today, I held their financial future in my hands. Today, they needed me more than I'd ever needed them. When Jessica escorted them into my office, the dynamic shift was immediately apparent. Visira, who'd spent decades treating me like an inconvenient piece of furniture, actually stood when I entered the room. Theric, who'd never bothered to learn the details of my business despite living in a town where my company's signs were visible on half the major construction projects, kept glancing at my awards wall with what looked like genuine surprise. Jonas, who'd perfected the art of looking through me at family gatherings, was actually making eye contact. But it was the young woman who captured my attention. She had the kind of nervous energy that reminded me of myself at 23. Eager to please, afraid of saying the wrong thing, clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission had brought her here. When our eyes met, she offered a tentative smile that seemed genuinely warm, untainted by the calculated politeness her family had perfected. "Lucen," Vasira began, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, something that might have been humility if I hadn't known better. "Thank you for seeing us. I know this is unexpected." I gestured toward the chairs arranged around my conference table, noting how they hesitated before sitting, as if they were uncertain about their right to occupy space in my domain. The reversal was so complete it felt almost surreal. For 23 years, I'd been the one seeking permission to exist in their world, and now they were the supplicants in mine. "I don't believe we've met," I said to the young woman, keeping my voice neutral but not hostile. "This is Avery," Therick said quickly, "Jonas's daughter. She's been away at college, so you wouldn't have crossed paths." Avery Thalvin. I calculated quickly. She would have been born around the time I started my business, which meant she'd grown up during the years when her family was systematically excluding me from their lives. She would have heard about me in whatever context they'd chosen to present me, probably as the disappointing husband who wasn't quite good enough for their standards. "It's nice to finally meet you," Avery said, and there was something in her voice, a warmth that seemed genuine, a courtesy that felt chosen rather than obligated. "I've heard so much about your landscaping work. The memorial garden you designed for the Westfield Medical Center is absolutely beautiful." I studied her face for signs of manipulation, for the calculated charm that came so naturally to the rest of her family but found none. She seemed nervous, yes, but also genuinely interested in connecting. It was possible, I realized, that Avery had formed her own opinion of me based on my public work rather than her family's private propaganda. "Thank you," I said. "That project was particularly meaningful to me." Vasira cleared her throat, reclaiming control of the conversation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing social situations. "Lucen, I'm sure you understand why we're here. Father's decision was unexpected for all of us, and we were hoping we could discuss the situation like family." Family. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with 23 years of irony. These people had spent decades making it clear that I wasn't really family, that I was tolerated rather than embraced, that my opinions and feelings were secondary to their comfort and convenience. Now facing financial uncertainty for the first time in their lives, they wanted to invoke family bonds that they'd never honored. "I'm listening," I said, settling back in my chair with the patience of someone who finally held all the cards. Therick leaned forward, his businessman's instincts taking over. "The thing is, Henrik's decision puts all of us in a difficult position. Dreville Industries has been family-owned for 3 generations. There are employees, contracts, responsibilities that go beyond personal inheritance. The company supports 47 families," Jonas added, speaking up for the first time. "People who've worked for us for decades who depend on the stability of family ownership." I nodded slowly, recognizing the strategy. They weren't here to appeal to my greed or my desire for revenge. They were appealing to my conscience, framing their request in terms of moral obligation to innocent employees who would suffer if I mismanaged their inheritance. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Vasira exchanged glances with her husband before continuing. "We were hoping you might consider allowing the family to continue managing the business operations while you retain ownership. A kind of partnership arrangement that would preserve the company's legacy while honoring Father's wishes." "You want me to be a silent partner?" I said. "To own the company on paper while you continue making all the actual decisions." "We have the experience," Therick said. "We understand the industry, the client relationships, the operational complexities. It would be a way to ensure continuity while respecting Father's intentions." I looked at Avery, who was studying her hands with obvious discomfort. "What do you think about this arrangement?" I asked her directly. She looked up, startled to be included in the conversation. "I'm not sure my opinion matters," she said carefully. "I'm just starting my career in social work. I don't really understand business." "Everyone's opinion matters," I said, meaning it, especially when family legacies are being discussed. Avery glanced at her father, then back at me. "I think," she said slowly, "that if grandfather wanted you to inherit everything, he probably had good reasons. He was a very thoughtful man." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vasira's smile became strained. Therick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jonas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Avery had just validated Henrik's judgment in a way that undermined their entire argument about the inheritance being some kind of mistake or manipulation. Of course, father had his reasons, Vasira said quickly, but family businesses are complex. There are emotional decisions and practical decisions, and sometimes they don't align perfectly. Tell me about the practical situation, I said. What specific challenges is the company facing? The question seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged another round of meaningful looks before Therick spoke. Well, there are some cash flow issues. Nothing catastrophic, but some of our major clients have been slow to pay, and we've had to extend credit terms to maintain relationships. How slow? I pressed. 60 days, Jonas said, maybe 90 on some of the larger accounts. I'd been in business long enough to know that 90-day payment delays didn't create emergency cash flow problems unless there were deeper issues. What about the company's reserves? Henrik was always conservative about maintaining operating capital. More uncomfortable glances. There have been some unexpected expenses, Vasira said vaguely. Market conditions have been challenging. Avery was looking increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between family members like she was watching a tennis match played with secrets and half-truths. I made a mental note to speak with her privately if the opportunity arose. Something told me she knew more about the family's financial situation than they were revealing. I'd need to see the books, I said. Before making any decisions about management arrangements, I'd want a complete financial audit performed by an independent accounting firm. The silence that followed was telling. In a healthy company, that request should have been met with easy agreement. Maybe even relief that the new owner was taking due diligence seriously. Instead, I was looking at 3 people who suddenly seemed very interested in studying the artwork on my walls. That seems unnecessary, Therick said finally. We're family. Surely we can work out an arrangement based on trust and good faith. Trust and good faith. From people who'd spent decades demonstrating that they considered me unworthy of basic respect. From people who'd excluded me from family decisions while expecting me to accept the consequences of choices I'd never been allowed to influence. Trust is earned, I said quietly, and in business, good faith is documented through transparent accounting. Vasira's composure finally cracked slightly. Lucen, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Everyone except the employees you mentioned, Avery said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The 47 families who depend on company stability. Her intervention surprised everyone, including me. She was looking directly at her grandmother now, her young face carrying an expression of dawning understanding that suggested she was putting pieces together in real time. What do you mean, sweetheart? Vasira asked, her voice carefully controlled. I mean, Avery said, her voice growing stronger, that if the company really is just having temporary cash flow problems, then Mr. Halreth's request for an audit should be welcomed, not resisted. Independent verification would prove that management has been responsible, which would make the partnership arrangement more attractive to everyone. She turned to look at me. But if there are reasons to avoid an audit, then maybe the employees need protection from something other than change in ownership. The silence that followed was profound. This 23-year-old woman, who'd been brought along as what I'd assumed was emotional leverage, had just articulated the central issue more clearly than any of the adults in the room. She'd also revealed that she understood exactly what was happening, that her family's desperation wasn't about preserving tradition or protecting employees, but about concealing something that wouldn't survive professional scrutiny. Therick stood abruptly. I think we've covered enough ground for one meeting, he said. Lucen, we appreciate your time. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up discussion after you've had time to consider our proposal. But I wasn't ready to let them leave yet, not when Avery's intervention had opened a door I needed to walk through. Actually, I said, I'd like to hear more about Avery's perspective. As someone from the younger generation who'll be affected by these decisions long-term, her insights could be valuable. Avery looked startled again, but also pleased. I'd be happy to share my thoughts, she said. Perhaps we could schedule a separate conversation, I suggested, watching her family's reaction carefully. I find that different generations often have different priorities when it comes to family legacy. The look that passed between Vasira, Therick, and Jonas was sharp enough to cut glass. They'd brought Avery as a prop, expecting her youth and sincerity to soften my resistance to their proposal. Instead, she'd become an independent voice, asking uncomfortable questions and accepting invitations they couldn't control. Avery has classes to get back to, Jonas said quickly. Her schedule is quite demanding. I'm actually on winter break, Avery corrected, earning a sharp look from her father. I'd be interested in learning more about grandfather's business, especially if I might have a role in its future. I smiled for the first time since they'd entered my office. Excellent, I said. Why don't you call Jessica tomorrow to set up a time that works for you? As they filed out of my office, I could feel the shift in power dynamics settling into place like pieces of a puzzle finding their proper positions. They'd come here expecting to negotiate from a position of moral authority, presenting themselves as the responsible stewards of a family legacy that needed protection from an outsider's inexperience. Instead, they'd revealed themselves as people with something to hide, something serious enough that they couldn't afford independent oversight. They'd also inadvertently provided me with an ally in Avery, someone who shared their bloodline but not their apparent willingness to sacrifice honesty for convenience. But most importantly, they'd confirmed what Henrik's letter had suggested, that their treatment of me hadn't been an isolated character flaw, but part of a pattern of behavior that extended to their business practices, their family relationships, and their fundamental approach to truth and accountability. The folding table was truly a distant memory now. I was no longer the powerless man seeking acceptance from people who'd never intended to grant it. I was the person with the authority to demand answers, to require transparency, to decide who deserved mercy and who needed justice. And I was just getting started. Avery arrived at my office 2 days later, but she wasn't alone. She'd brought a cardboard box and a laptop bag, both of which she set carefully on my conference table before taking a seat. Her hands were shaking slightly, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much since our last meeting. I need to show you something, she said without preamble. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll protect the employees. Whatever you decide to do after seeing this, please don't let innocent people suffer from my family's mistakes. The gravity in her voice made my chest tighten. What kind of mistakes are we talking about? She opened the laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet that looked like it had been compiled over many hours. I've been working in the company's administrative office during my college breaks, she said. Just filing, data entry, basic clerical work. But I have accounting classes, and some of the numbers never made sense to me. She turned the screen toward me, pointing to columns of figures that at first glance looked like standard business expenses. These are payments to shell companies, she said. Consulting fees, service contracts, maintenance agreements, except none of these companies actually exist. I leaned forward, studying the data more carefully. The amounts were significant. Tens of thousands of dollars per month flowing to entities with generic names like Professional Services LLC and Strategic Solutions Group. Over the 3 years of records Avery had compiled, the total reached into the millions. How did you verify that they don't exist? I asked. I looked them up, she said simply. Business registrations, tax records, online presence. Nothing. Some of them have addresses that turn out to be empty lots, or residential homes where nobody's ever heard of these companies. She opened the cardboard box and pulled out a stack of invoices. These are the supporting documents for those payments. They're all signed by Dad, but look at this. She spread several invoices across the table, pointing to subtle differences in the letterhead designs, the font choices, the formatting. Someone created these on a computer, I said, recognizing the amateur desktop publishing that tried to look professional but missed key details that real businesses would get right. And there's more. Avery's voice was barely above a whisper now. The real companies we do business with, the ones that actually provide services, their payments have been getting delayed, while these fake payments go out on schedule. We owe legitimate contractors over $400,000, but somehow there's always money for consulting fees to companies that don't exist. I sat back, feeling the full weight of what she was showing me. This wasn't just poor management or cash flow problems. This was systematic embezzlement, theft on a scale that could destroy the company and potentially land everyone involved in federal prison. Avery, I said carefully, do you understand what you're alleging here? She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. I know exactly what I'm alleging. My family has been stealing from grandfather's company, from their own employees, from you. From me? You're the owner now, she said. Every dollar they've stolen since grandfather's death is money they've taken from you. And if they'd succeeded in convincing you to let them keep managing the company, they would have kept doing it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't come to my office to negotiate a management arrangement out of concern for employees or family legacy. They'd come to maintain access to their personal embezzlement scheme. The desperate urgency I'd sensed wasn't about preserving tradition, it was about avoiding discovery. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. Avery pulled out another set of documents. "Based on what I could find, at least 5 years, maybe longer. The early records aren't as detailed, but there are patterns that suggest it started small and grew over time." 5 years. While I'd been sitting at folding tables and accepting their dismissive treatment, they'd been systematically looting the company that would eventually become mine. While Henrik had been planning to leave me everything, his own family had been stealing what they assumed would be their inheritance. "Does your grandfather's death change anything about the legal implications?" Avery asked. I thought about it. "It might make it worse," I said. "If they continued stealing after becoming aware of the will's contents, that could be seen as theft from the new owner. And if they were trying to hide the theft by maintaining management control, that adds conspiracy charges." Avery's composure finally cracked. "I can't believe they did this," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I knew something was wrong. Dad's been driving expensive cars, and Mom's been renovating their house with money that didn't seem to come from his salary, but I never imagined it was this bad." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "These people are your family. You could have stayed quiet and hoped I'd never discover it." She looked up at me with Henrik's eyes, clear and determined despite her tears. "Because grandfather trusted you enough to leave you everything, and I trust his judgment. Because 47 families depend on this company for their livelihoods, and they don't deserve to lose their jobs because of theft. And because, quote," her voice grew stronger, "I don't want to be the kind of person who covers up crimes just because we share DNA." I spent the next hour reviewing the evidence she'd compiled, cross-referencing invoices with bank records, tracking the flow of money from legitimate business accounts to the fake companies. The pattern was clear, methodical, and utterly damning. This wasn't impulsive theft or momentary weakness. This was professional-level fraud that had been planned and executed with cold calculation. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally. "I want you to stop them," she said. "I want you to save the company and protect the employees. And I want them to face the consequences of what they've done. Even if those consequences include prison?" Avery was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather spent 40 years building something he was proud of," she said. "He trusted you to protect that legacy. If I help them avoid justice, I'm betraying his trust just as much as they did." I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd hoped never to use. "Marcus Chen," I said when the call connected. "This is Lucen Halreth. I need you to put together a forensic accounting team. Emergency priority." Marcus was a former federal prosecutor who'd moved into white-collar criminal defense, someone I'd met through industry connections but never expected to need personally. "How emergency are we talking?" he asked. "I need a full audit of a company I just inherited, and I need it done quietly but quickly. I suspect there's been significant embezzlement, possibly ongoing." "How significant?" I looked at Avery's spreadsheet. "Multiple millions over several years. The people responsible are family members who are currently trying to maintain management control." "Jesus," Marcus said. "Don't touch anything else, don't confront anyone, and don't let them know you're investigating. I'll have a team there tomorrow morning." After I hung up, Avery and I sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of what we'd set in motion felt enormous. Lives would be destroyed, relationships would be shattered, people would go to prison. But the alternative was allowing the theft to continue while innocent employees remained at risk. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked her. She nodded slowly. "I think so. It's scary, but it's also a relief. I've been carrying this knowledge for months, wondering if I was imagining things or misunderstanding what I was seeing. Now I know I was right to be concerned." "Your family is going to blame you for this," I warned her. "I know," she said, "but they're going to blame you more. And they're going to fight this with everything they have." She was right, of course. When Vasira, Therick, and Jonas discovered that their scheme had been exposed, they wouldn't go quietly. They'd hire lawyers, claim they were being framed, paint themselves as victims of a vindictive outsider who'd manipulated their father's inheritance to destroy their family. But I wasn't the broken man from the folding table anymore. I had evidence, allies, and the moral authority that comes from being on the right side of both law and justice. More importantly, I had something they'd never possessed: the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. The confrontation was coming, and this time, I would be ready for it. The forensic audit took 3 weeks. Marcus's team worked with the efficiency of surgeons, dissecting every financial record with precision that left no room for doubt or denial. When they presented their final report, the evidence was overwhelming. $4.7 million stolen over 6 years through a sophisticated network of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. But Vazira, Theric, and Jonas didn't wait for the audit to conclude before launching their counterattack. Within days of learning about the investigation, they hired Blackstone and Associates, the most expensive white-collar defense firm in the state, and began a campaign designed to discredit both the evidence and my motives for pursuing it. Their strategy was predictable but professionally executed. They claimed Henrik had been suffering from dementia when he changed his will, despite the medical evaluations that proved otherwise. They alleged that I had manipulated an elderly man's affections to secure an inheritance I didn't deserve. They painted themselves as victims of a vindictive outsider who was using their father's legacy to destroy a family that had never fully accepted him. The local newspaper ran a series of articles presenting both sides of what they called the Drevell family inheritance dispute. Vazira gave interviews portraying herself as a grieving daughter whose father's final wishes were being twisted by someone seeking revenge for old family tensions. Theric appeared on a business podcast explaining how family companies were vulnerable to hostile takeovers by marriage and the dangers of letting outsiders control generational wealth. For a few weeks, their narrative gained traction. I received phone calls from longtime clients asking if the allegations were true, whether my company was somehow connected to the controversy swirling around Drevell Industries. Several potential projects were quietly postponed while people waited to see how the situation would resolve. But Marcus had anticipated their strategy. White-collar criminals always claim they're the real victims, he told me during one of our strategy sessions. The key is letting the evidence speak louder than their publicity campaign. When the criminal charges were filed, the evidence spoke with devastating clarity. Federal prosecutors presented bank records, forged documents, and detailed financial trails that made denial impossible. The shell companies were traced to accounts controlled by Theric and Jonas. The fake invoices were linked to computers in their homes and offices. Expert testimony established that the theft had been systematic, deliberate, and ongoing for years. Avery testified as a witness for the prosecution, walking the jury through her discovery of the fraudulent payments with the calm professionalism of someone who'd chosen justice over family loyalty. When Theric's lawyer tried to portray her testimony as the result of manipulation by me, she responded with quiet dignity that devastated their credibility. "Mr. Halreth didn't discover this fraud," she said. "I did. He didn't ask me to investigate my family. I chose to investigate because I saw evidence of theft, and I chose to act on it. No one manipulated me except my own conscience." The trial lasted 2 months. When the verdicts came down, Theric received 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering. Jonas got 6 years for his role in the conspiracy. Vazira, who had helped launder stolen money through personal accounts, received 4 years and agreed to cooperate with asset recovery efforts in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the real resolution came during the company restructuring. With the forensic audit complete and the criminals convicted, I had a clear picture of Drevell Industries' actual financial situation. Stripped of the embezzlement losses, the company was not only solvent but profitable. The cash flow problems they'd claimed were entirely artificial, created by the systematic theft of operating capital. I kept my promise to Avery about protecting the employees. Every worker kept their job, and I used recovered assets to fund overdue payments to legitimate contractors and vendors. I also implemented profit-sharing programs and enhanced benefits that gave employees a real stake in the company's future success. Avery declined my offer to take an official position in the company, choosing instead to complete her social work degree while serving as an informal advocate for ethical business practices. "I want to help families heal from trauma," she told me, "and I think I learned something about how to do that by watching what you've done here." The memorial garden at Thornfield Heights became my private refuge during the most difficult months. I would walk the paths Henrik and I had planned together, remembering our conversations about legacy and worth. He'd known this day would come, Not the specific details of theft and prosecution, but the eventual reckoning between his family's cruelty and my character. The folding table from that first Thanksgiving is gone now, donated to a community center, where it can serve people who need furniture more than symbols. But I kept the memory of what it represented. The systematic diminishment of human worth based on arbitrary standards of belonging. Today, I sit at the head of Henrik's mahogany conference table, making decisions that affect hundreds of employees and their families. The portraits in the hallway now include photographs from company events where everyone is welcome, where worth is measured by contribution rather than bloodline. The business has thrived under ethical management. Drevel Industries has become a model for transparent corporate governance, with independent oversight and employee representation that ensures no one person can abuse their authority. We've expanded into sustainable construction practices, pioneering techniques that honor Henrik's vision of building something meaningful that will outlast its creators. But the most important lesson wasn't about business success or financial vindication. It was about the power of standing up when silence becomes complicity. For 23 years, I accepted their treatment because challenging it seemed harder than enduring it. I told myself that keeping peace was more important than demanding justice. I was wrong. The peace I preserved by staying quiet wasn't real peace. It was the temporary comfort that comes from avoiding necessary conflict. Real peace comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it's difficult. Real peace comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves, from speaking truth even when lies would be easier to live with. Avery understood this instinctively. At 23, she had the courage to expose crimes committed by her own family because she recognized that loyalty to people isn't the same as loyalty to their actions. She taught me that family isn't defined by shared genetics but by shared values, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. The man who sat at folding tables and accepted gift cards to hardware stores is gone forever. In his place stands someone who understands that worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, that respect can't be inherited but must be earned, and that the only approval that truly matters is the kind that comes from living with integrity even when no one is watching. Henrik's letter sits framed on my desk now, a daily reminder that someone was always watching, always believing in the man I could become if I found the courage to stop accepting less than I deserved. And when I look in the mirror each morning, I see exactly what he saw. Not the perfect son he never had, but the good man I was all along, finally strong enough to claim his place at the table he'd always belonged at. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.